Okay, hello folks. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. This week we've got chapters 21, 22, and 23. And David continues to make his escape, but runs into some unexpected trouble. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 21. David refueled in Corpus Christi and continued to make his way down the coast. His plan was to stop near Matamoros, then on to Tampico, Veracruz, Campeche, Cancun, then on to the Cayman Islands. This would keep him close to land and out of the open ocean. David thought this was best, taking into account the fact that he had only navigated small lakes before this. David really didn't care how long the trip took, but the sooner he could get his gold in a bank vault, the better. As David neared the dock in Tampico, he noticed a small boat following behind him on the same heading. David had an uneasy feeling. Until now, his journey had been uneventful, but prospectors never let their guard down. David got out a pair of binoculars and took a look at the boat. It had no official markings or stickers, and it had not been taken care of. There appeared to be 4 men above deck. David had no idea how many were below. The men David could see looked scroungy and unkempt, much like the boat. David's uneasy feeling intensified. As David approached what appeared to be the public dock, he slowed his boat and looked around. To his right was what appeared to be the fueling station. David eased his boat up to the fueling station, and with his very limited Spanish, told the attendant to fill it up. While the attendant was filling the boat, David asked where the fresh water was. The attendant pointed to a garden hose which was rolled onto a reel. David took the hose and started filling his fresh water tank. "I'll have to add some chlorine to this for sure," David muttered. When both tanks were full, David paid the attendant, then maneuvered his boat into one of the slips at the dock. As David was tying off, a man walked up and started rattling off something in Spanish. David held up his hands to indicate he didn't know what the hell the man was saying. The man seemed to get the idea, because he pointed at the dock and then rubbed his fingers together to indicate money. David got the idea that this man either owned the dock or was an employee of the man who did. David reached into his pocket and got out a $20 bill. When David handed the money to the man reached into his pocket as if to give David change for his $20. David held his hands up to stop the man and indicated that he needed no change. The man smiled and graciously thanked David. David knew enough Spanish to understand that much. David had learned that when you were in Mexico, to tip everyone. It was amazing what a $5 tip would get you. The entire time David had been fueling his boat and getting it tied to the dock, the other boat had been sitting a few hundred feet from the dock. Now the boat pulled up to the opposite side of the dock and began tying off. The man David assumed was a dock attendant started walking toward the boat. When the attendant got halfway there, he stopped, turned around, and walked back up the dock. David didn't like the look of that at all. He went inside and unstrapped the AR-15 and the shotgun from their cabinet. He then made sure they were fully loaded and also strapped on his pistol. David got down out of sight and made himself as comfortable as possible. He dozed a little every now and again, but didn't get much sleep. As soon as it was light enough to see, David untied his boat and eased away from the dock. As soon as he got clear, he put his engines at full throttle. Under normal conditions, David's boat should have been able to outrun the other boat, but since it was laden down with gold, it just didn't have the power needed. David made it out to open water before he saw that the other boat was pursuing him. When he realized that he could not outrun his pursuers, he cut the throttle back and then stopped the boat. David positioned the rifles out of sight, but readily accessible. The other boat soon caught up to David and circled him a few times, then came in close. David could see the men all had pistols, but no rifles were visible. Again, David could only see 4 men. As they got close, one of the men said in broken English, "Hello, we are the Mexican Coast Guard, and we need to search your boat." "Not gonna happen," David shouted back. The men had a short conversation in Spanish amongst themselves. Then the man turned back to David. "Okay, we try to be nice. Now we just take your boat and feed you to the fish, eh, gringo?" The man shouted back as he reached for the pistol that was tucked in his belt. David ducked down under the railings and grabbed the AR-15. He then moved a few feet to the right of where he had been standing. David drew a mental picture of where the men had been standing on the boat. David took a deep breath, let it out, then stood up and started to unload the AR-15 at the other boat. The men on the other boat were caught totally off guard. They thought David was just another tourist that had strayed too far from home. The AR-15 mowed them down before they realized what was happening. Without taking a head count, David ducked below the railings and put another clip in the AR-15, stood up and started firing at the boat again. When this clip was empty, David reloaded and looked closely. There was no movement on the deck. He could see most of the men. They were not moving. David fired a couple of more rounds. The men still did not move. David moved his boat alongside the other and tied the two together. Cautiously, David climbed onto the other boat. The 4 men appeared to be dead. David checked each of them for a pulse. 3 of them were dead for sure, but David thought he felt a weak pulse in one of them. David promptly shot him in the head, just to make sure. David eased his way below deck into the cabin. As he got closer, he could hear muffled cries from one of the rooms. David tried the door. It was locked. He took another deep breath, then kicked the door in. Rifle at the ready, David entered the room. What he found shocked him. There were 3 young women tied and gagged in one corner of the room. David approached the nearest one and tried to remove the gag, but the woman fought him. They were clearly terrified. When David removed the gag, the woman started hysterically screaming at him in Spanish. David tried to console the woman, but to no avail. Finally, David replaced the gag, took hold of the woman's head with both hands, and forced her to look him in the face. "I'm not going to hurt you. No habla español." This seemed to calm her down slightly, so David again removed the gag. She didn't scream at him this time, but kept speaking in Spanish. David looked at her again and said, "No habla español." David had laid his rifle down to cut the woman free. The second David cut her bonds, the woman grabbed the rifle and started firing in what appeared to be a closet. As David wrestled the rifle away from the woman, the closet door opened and a man fell out onto the floor. David realized what was happening and quickly returned the rifle to the woman and drew his pistol. "Are there any more?" David asked the woman. The woman had a puzzled look on her face. David held up 4 fingers, pointed to the upper deck, and drew his thumb across his neck. Apparently the woman caught his meaning, because she lowered the rifle and seemed to calm down a bit. David holstered his pistol and started cutting the other women free. David herded the frightened women onto his boat, and then went back and threw the dead bodies into the ocean. "Yep, fish do have to eat," David muttered to himself. He then started the boat's engine, put it in gear, and bumped the throttle to just off idle. David then pointed the boat out toward the open ocean, climbed back aboard his boat, and cut the line connecting the two. The other boat started a slow journey into the open ocean. David then moved the ladies into the galley and set some water and food out for them to make themselves some sandwiches. He waited until he thought they got the idea, and then went to the engine controls. He put his boat back on course and bumped the throttles up a notch. He wanted to get clear of the area as quick as possible. David then went back to the galley. The women were gorging themselves as if they had not eaten for days. David went to a cabinet and got out 3 beach towels. He set them on the sofa and opened the door to the bathroom. David got their attention and pointed to the shower. They seemed to grasp the meaning. David picked up his laptop and went back up on deck, leaving the women to themselves. David knew he would need to learn Spanish, so he had bought some computer software to teach him. The software had come with a headset and was interactive. It also had a translation program. David spent the next hour learning how to run the software. When he thought he had a good understanding, he went back down below deck. 2 of the women were seated at the table. The other appeared to be washing their clothes in the sink. They were wearing the beach towels David had laid out. Their long dark hair was wet, so David assumed they had taken a shower. Because they were wearing only the beach towels, David could not help but notice how beautiful they were. David sat down at the table and got the software going. He pointed to the microphone and said, "Hello, my name is David." In a few seconds, the computer translated that into Spanish and played it over the speakers. "You are safe, and I mean you no harm." David waited for the computer to finish, then he switched the software to translate the opposite way. He then handed the microphone to the first woman he had untied. She spoke into the microphone. "My name is Salida. Thank you for rescuing us." As both of them learned how to use the software better, the conversation got faster. David learned that the 2 other women were sisters, Nita and Belinda. All 3 women had been kidnapped and held for ransom, but now that their families were out of money, the men had intended to sell them as slaves. They were on their way to meet a slave trader when they had run across David. "Try to get some sleep. I'll sleep up on deck," David said, as he took the laptop and left. He spent another hour learning a little more Spanish. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off and he fell asleep. Chapter 22. David awoke the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon. He went to the galley and found that the women were up, dressed, and had breakfast cooked. After living alone for so many years, this was a little strange to David. While eating breakfast, with the use of the laptop, David told the women his next stop was Veracruz. This was good news for the 2 sisters, because they had family in Veracruz. Salida didn't seem to care one way or the other. She asked David if she could use the laptop to learn more English. David finished his breakfast, handed the laptop to Salida, and went to check their course and progress. When they docked at Veracruz, as the women were stepping off the boat, David handed the 2 sisters $500. They thanked him graciously, saying that he was a saint, and hurried on their way. David turned to Salida and attempted to hand her some money as well. She, however, would not take the money from David's hand. She just stared down at the deck of the boat. David took his hand and gently raised her head up to match her eyes with his. "What's wrong?" David asked. "I have little to go back to. Would it be all right if I just stayed on the boat with you?" David was completely caught off guard by this. He just stood there saying nothing. The first part of his brain to start working again was the prospector section. "She knows about the gold and wants to rob you," this part of his brain insisted. Then the logical section kicked in. How could she know of the gold? It's sealed in the crates. David looked deep into Salida's eyes. He could find no deception or malice. "Well, I guess we could try it and see how it works," he said with a smile. Tears of joy started streaming from Salida's eyes, and she impulsively hugged David. This, of course, caught him off guard and off balance, and they both fell back onto the deck. They refueled and resupplied and continued on down the coast. That night, as David was making himself comfortable up on deck, Salida walked up from below. She was completely nude. David just stood there with his mouth open, watching the moonlight dance off her skin. She walked over and took David's hand, pulling him toward the lower cabin. "You don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said in a soft voice. Chapter 23. A couple of hours after leaving Campeche, David noticed a small boat coming up fast from behind him. David got out his binoculars for a better look. The boat seemed to be manned by some young boys. Most of them looked to be in their teens. David handed Salida the binoculars. She studied the boat for a moment, then said, "I have heard of these kids. They call themselves pirates and rob the tourists. I have never heard of them hurting anyone. They mostly just take cash and jewelry." "I swear," David said in a disgusting tone, "the next time I'm buying a plane and learning to fly." David retrieved the guns from their cabinet. "Can you handle this?" David asked Salida, indicating the shotgun. "Yes, I used to go quail hunting with my father." "Ever kill any of them?" "Yes," she answered in a tone that suggested she was wondering why he would ask such a rhetorical question. That was enough for David. He handed her the shotgun. David had been quail hunting many times and had found the little birds quite a challenge to hit. When the boat was within range, David took the AR-15 and put 5 shots into the water just in front of the boat. The boat veered off to the right. David figured they were just getting out of range, but the boat kept turning, and soon it was heading in the direction it came. "Guess they just thought they wanted to be pirates," David told Salida. "What's next? A sea monster?"